welcome everybody. I'm Dr Jon Sutton. I'm editor of the Psychologist at the British Psychological Society. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us in these challenging times. I know everybody's spinning a lot of plates, so it means a lot to us that so many of you have decided to join us on this webinar, and we hope it's going to be engaging and informative and timely, I think. I should obviously say I salute any of you as psychologists that are working on the front line or with the front line. So I've kind of got the closest I could get to a rainbow in tribute, and my heart goes out to anyone who's been personally affected by the pandemic. I say that because it may well feel too soon in a way to be looking towards the new normal. I'm concerned about striking the right tone, but on the Psychologist, we've been using the phrase the new normal since kind of mid-March in planning for what's going to be a special summer edition of the magazine, which considers how people and society and psychology might be changed by the virus, the lockdown, coming out of lockdown, the whole new world afterwards. We're still seeking contributions for that, so find more information on our website, which is thepsychologist.bps.org.uk. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about change. So I think that there are two main strands to that. How people might be changed in the new normal, how might psychology be changed in the new normal, and as part of that, I think, how might we need to change? What lessons might we have learned about how research informs policy, and that whole policy making process and the interactions between psychologists and government? Can we build a psychological government? And that hashtag PsychGov, G-O-V, is the hashtag if you'd like to tweet about this webinar. We're on Twitter at PsychMag and at BPS Official. So please do join in that discussion. There are moderators, co-hosts on this webinar who will be keeping an eye on PsychGov as a hashtag and also on the chat function in Zoom. So please do submit questions. We're aiming for the discussion to last around 45 minutes, leaving up to 30 minutes for questions, but it may well be that we come to some questions after 20 minutes, depending on how the discussion's going. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our three discussants for the afternoon. I think, we've got an incredible panel here. Thank you very much to Saskia as one of the amazing BPS policy advisors for pulling this together. We have Dr Rowena Hill, a psychologist from Nottingham Trent University. Look, she waves, this works. A psychologist from Nottingham Trent University who is currently seconded full-time to the cross-governmental C19 Foresight Group. We have Susan Michie, Professor Susan Michie, Professor of Health Psychology and Director of the Centre for Behaviour Change at University College London. She has advised the government as part of SAGE's Behavioural Science Advisory Group. So for people who haven't been keeping up with the news, SAGE is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. And she's speaking here as an independent expert. And we also have Kathryn Scott, who is Director of Policy at the British Psychological Society. Okay, so welcome to our three discussants. I know them all through years of working at the Psychologist, so I'm going to revert to first name terms. And I think I'm going to start with you, Susan. So I think the timing of the webinar is interesting. I think it feels like we're entering a new phase where potentially psychology could be as important or more important even than how it informed the initial pandemic response. So the world is a very different place compared with a few months ago, and there have been huge shifts in mind and behaviour. I'm interested in your perspective on what role psychological evidence and a psychological approach has played in that, and what more can be done at this point.
Well, that's a huge question that you're posing. Thinking about the lockdown and what psychology can contribute to the next phase of coming out of it, which I think is what a lot of us are thinking about and engaged in. There's a couple of things I would say. One thing is that the easing of restrictions is going to not be across the board in the way that the lockdown was. And that's going to mean that different parts of society are being affected very differently. Some will be going back to work and really keen to generate income. Others will be expected to go back to work and very reticent because they'll be worried about safe working conditions. Then you'll have some people who are being asked to stay at home, who are very pleased to because they're anxious about the possibility of getting infected. Others being asked to stay at home who want to get out and about. So the sense of collective solidarity that's built up over the last few weeks, I think will be strained in terms of different parts of society reacting differently. I think there's going to be an interesting new issue of people who have become more anxious about returning to work and the outside world generally, because we've been in a situation for several weeks now where we've associated being at home with safety. And, so there are two things. One is it will be objectively riskier when we have to go on public transport, go to work situations, but also I think there'll be a psychological dimension of anxiety and fear that I think psychologists could be very helpful with in terms of helping people with strategies to overcome that.
Just sticking with you for a minute there, Susan, what role does messaging play in that, in terms of the consistency and clarity of messaging at a time when, as you're saying, they're likely to be, in a way, different messages for different groups, really?
Well, even when we've had the same message for the whole population, there's still been problems of different things being said by different people, and also kind of a lack of clarity. I mean, the latest one over the last couple of days that's come to the fore has been the issue about over 70-year-olds and the sort of blanket guidance of staying at home if you're over 70, whereas we know there's lots of very fit, active, over 70-year-olds, pillars of their community, who A, don't want to be staying at home, and B, don't think they should, and C, think this is a rather ageist way of looking at things. So I think guidance has to be very clear and nuanced, and I think that what needs to happen, especially going forwards, is explanation and the principles underlying guidance so that people really understand them and can apply that guidance and that information to their own situation in a sensible, intelligent way, which is, I think, how people have been operating, trying to work out what does this mean for me and my family. But I think that going forward, where it's going to be so much more complicated than it's been over the last few weeks, that becomes ever more important.
And those principles underlying the communication, I mean, you're well known for your health psychology model, COM-B, so capability, opportunity, motivation, then leading to behaviour. What aspects of the messaging so far do you think have been, have been good, and what perhaps could have been more effective in those psychological model terms?
Okay, let me take a couple of examples where I'd say there was room for improvement. One was, if you remember, that beautiful sunny weekend before the Easter weekend, after our long, grey, rainy winter, when everybody went outside, as we all did. And what happened with everybody going outside was that suddenly the park seemed very full, and the newspapers photographed people being seemingly quite close together. And the response was, well, if you're going to behave like that, we're going to close the parks. Not having looked at the data and the evidence or understood the complexity of human behaviour. The data showed that more than 90% of people were highly motivated to stick to the guidance, to keep 2 meters apart. The problem wasn't one of motivation, and it wasn't one of not knowing, it was one of opportunity. There wasn't sufficient green spaces for people to get out to. So from that point of view, the answer should not have been, you naughty children, we're going to punish you because this is a motivational problem by closing the parks. It should have been, obviously there's not enough space for everybody to do what we're recommending, which is get outside every day and exercise in the open air. Let's open the golf courses, of which there's 45,000 acres in London, and school playing fields, for example. Another issue is the issue which is so key, and I think psychology has had an input and could do much more, the personal protective behaviours. If you think about it, if the whole population did 4 things, which was to keep hands clean, to use tissues appropriately to catch coughs and sneezes, and to not touch eyes, nose and mouth, and keep 2 meters apart, this pandemic would stop dead in its tracks. That would cut all the transmission. And we're being told to do that. So tick for knowledge, tick for motivation, tick for opportunity mainly. I mean, the social distancing does depend on other people. But one of the issues is skills. And we haven't had anything about skills. I have been saying several times on the broadcast, we want an hour program every day for psychologists, behavioural scientists, to be engaging the population with how to do these things. You know, how do you make rules that stick, the sort of if-then plans? If I go into a building, if I'm about to eat or prepare food, then I wash my hands. Make it a routine, make it a habit. We've got evidence we can use about how to do that. The issue about not touching eyes, nose and mouth, completely different type of behaviour. This is a more automatic behaviour. The evidence suggests we're doing it more than 20 times an hour, usually without being aware of it. So therefore, a rule isn't going to help. But building an incompatible behaviour and habit, such as keeping your hands below shoulder level, could. So different type of behaviour, different type of strategy. Okay. Then to tissues, another kind of behaviour again, because it's reliant on having a tissue on you. And so changing the way one does things, for example, having one pocket with your clean tissues, another pocket with your dirty tissues, you know, getting that established right in the morning or at different pockets in your bag, that can get that behaviour going. So those are just illustrations whereby analysing the behaviours with that sort of framework can come up with more sophisticated strategies that are much more likely to be effective.
Okay. Rowena, while psychologists like Susan are looking at those strategies about the behaviour here and now, what's going to happen tomorrow, quite early on in the response, you got the call from government to join the Foresight Group. Can you explain a little bit about the different emphasis of that in terms of time and scope?
Of course. I really want to touch my nose now, but based on what Susan's just said, I'm slightly scratch my nose quickly. Yes, so we're a cross-departmental government group that's basically been set up to look in the longer term. So, as you say, quite early on, the government response was very quickly activated, and there was a lot of activity going on around those initial few days, and making sure that we were listening to advice and advising the public as to what was going on and how to respond. There was a group of people who I'm very thankful for, not because of my position, but very quickly they realised that actually we were going to need to start thinking about this in terms of weeks, months and a longer time frame. And that's where the Foresight Group was conceived and born. So we're relatively new in the emergency management structure, but essentially what we're looking at is primary and secondary impacts, and trying to do some work that is solid and tangible and good to pass on to those other departments. And there's a couple of reasons around that. One is because we know that the timeline for this, when we consider it with other emergencies, it's going to be much longer. And the second part of the value of our group is around that cross-department. So usually in UK government structures where we're looking at emergency management, we're usually looking at response and recovery. So response is how do we manage that immediate threat to life, and then at some point that will then complete and we'll go into recovery. we know already, and it's obvious when people start thinking about these about the effects of COVID-19 that that isn't necessarily going to be the best way of thinking about this, because it's a much more complicated picture. So when we're thinking about COVID-19, if it's anywhere in the world, we kind of have to live with it. We need to, until there's a vaccine that's developed, we are probably going to be managing both behavioural and social, but also economic, kind of bit of a balancing act. So as we have decided to put measures in place in order to protect people, so we might need to, as Susan's already alluded to, that might need to change and adapt as we change our behaviours. So if we open public parks and that changes, and that R rate that we're so educated about now, that R rate starts to change, then obviously we do need to be responsive for that, responsive to that. So what we're thinking around is around a framework that, instead of response and recovery, that recovery piece at a national and also subnational level is already started. So we're thinking about that much longer term. How do we work towards a new normal? What does that look like? What do we need to do as a collective group, as UK, to try and get ourselves there in the best possible way that we can? But there's also some more intermediate phases. So there might be, for example, if we aren't balancing those behavioural interventions, and the R rate does start to exponentially go up, then, as we've heard on the briefings, we will need to manage that. So we're thinking around adaptation and stabilisation after that initial response of the first peak, and hopefully we won't need to do another full-on response for the second peak, because hopefully we'll be able to manage it so that there isn't that second peak. So adaptation is much more around kind of a range of behavioural interventions in order to manage the spread of the virus. The stabilisation piece is around, or thought process framework. We're still kind of finding the language with these things. That's much more around kind of economic stabilisation. Obviously, we have taken a bold step as humanity almost, but certainly in the UK, to think, okay, we're going to put on hold our ability to make money in order to protect lives. And obviously that does have a consequence. So when we're thinking forward, you mentioned multidisciplinary approaches before. When we're looking forward ahead of time, obviously there is societal implications of COVID-19, there's economic implications of COVID-19, and when we're looking months and potentially years ahead, it's how we balance all of those. So that's why we're starting to think around new. It's not necessarily that COVID-19 means we forget everything that we've ever learned and it's just so new and it's so all-consuming, but it's how we package those different experiences of the pandemic life cycle that we're probably about to go through.
I thought it was interesting that you're still finding the language around these things, because your background in terms of research is, at least in part, in terms of that crisis, disaster and emergency management, where there tends to be a day after. And like we spoke last week, and there was a phrase that you used where you said, it's with COVID, it's everyone, everywhere, everything. There's nothing that's untouched. And I thought it's just really interesting in terms of how you need to kind of reframe things in your own head before we look at the response for the public as well. So,
yeah, absolutely. Sorry, just to come back in on that as well, I think there's also there's an important thing around language to understand as a nation, for those who are leading that response, what we're doing and what we're talking about and how we're responding. So Susan earlier on mentioned that actually, as we're exiting out of the initial kind of, we're relaxing those lockdown measures, it might become much more regional and it might become much more geographically located. And I think that's when the language becomes really important, to make sure that actually we're comparing apples with apples or fruit salad with fruit salad, because then that piece, communication piece to the public, becomes so much more important. Yeah. At the moment, what we've got is a really blunt mechanism of lockdown. And once we start having to nuance that, as the virus potentially might start looking and expressing different things in different geographical regions, that's when that communication becomes really, really important.
That's where that comes to Kathryn, I think, because in terms of the nuance and one-size-fits-all policies, we've talked about that before, Kathryn, and I think this is a really interesting aspect for you in that you see very smart psychologists like Susan and Rowena advising the government directly on this. This must be wonderful for the British Psychological Society's Director of Policy to see psychology having an impact in that way. And I think you've got views on precisely how it's having that impact. I think.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's what we've been focused on in the policy team at the BPS is really, where does psychology and policy making overlap? And we're really interested in what happens in that space. And what we've got here with the COVID pandemic is seeing many of the themes that we've been thinking about unfolding right in front of our eyes. And that's, watching it in real time is teaching us so much about how psychology can have an impact on policy making. And there's a couple of things that I want to draw from that have been talked about. One is this sense of kind of complexity and emotion and the fact that, as psychologists, to steal a phrase from one of the members of our psychological government steering group, we're experts of the unknown. We are people who can think about unintended consequences. We can think about emotional reactions and talk about them in a way that your other disciplines can't, and I think that's something where if we're able to kind of talk about these things with confidence and embrace that element of our discipline, we can really add value in the policy making space. And for me, it's really about psychology kind of establishing our place at the table and not thinking about different scientific disciplines in any sort of hierarchy, but thinking about how they come together in this kind of jigsaw puzzle where when the government and policymakers are looking for answers, not to just come to one discipline or not to come to one area where, perhaps they've relied on in the past. And I think that's where, groups like the behavioural science group that's advising SAGE, that the strength of bringing those different disciplines to the table is really, really important. And I think one of the things we're able to do is apply some of our kind of, where there are no answers or where there's certainly no one size fits all, psychologists have a way of approaching things in terms of frameworks and models that we might say, okay, there is no evidence in this space. This has never happened before. We can think about events that might be similar in certain ways, but what we can then, where the evidence base isn't entirely there and entirely solid, we can draw on our kind of theoretical approaches and frameworks to think about, okay, what's the most sensible options that we might get from this? And I think that's where we, and we're getting more confident at being able to do that and to value that in ourselves, and others are valuing that from our discipline.
I'm going to come back to Susan on that because just in the last week, Susan, I've seen a transcript of your evidence to government on the possible unintended consequences of the use of the NHS app. And I just think, if I come to you, Susan, on, how is that when you give evidence like that, how is it received? Is it received as psychological evidence from a psychologist or just, a view from a smart person? Does it matter to you at all whether this evidence is coming from psychology and from a particular published bit of work, or are you just in there to try to inform decision-making in a generally psychological way?
So first of all, I think you're thinking about the testimony I gave to the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee. It was actually on the question of immunity passports rather than the contact tracing app. There was a session afterwards on contact tracing app that I didn't contribute to. I think it's incredibly important to ensure that the statements one makes is grounded in some kind of science, whether that's social sciences more broadly, whether it's randomized controlled trials or observational data, whether it's focus groups, interviews, polling data, so long as you're clear about what the nature of the evidence is that you're drawing on, and where there's not evidence, because in this situation, it's a novel situation, there's very little direct evidence, there's some coming out now. one's drawing on principles drawn from evidence, say from systematic reviews of evidence of different diseases in different countries at different times, but where there's signals coming out, for example, the psychological impact of quarantine that one can draw on in informing the current situation, all drawing on principles from theory, which themselves are summaries of what we know about a particular topic. So I think it's, as psychologists, social and behavioural scientists, we're there as scientists, which means informing what we say with evidence and theoretical understanding.
Rowena, when you've been in situations since your secondment where the evidence isn't there, are we as psychologists unusual in that? Are there gaps in other evidence spaces so everyone's on a level playing field when it comes to drawing on the evidence?
I think so. Certainly when echoing some of Susan's comments, particularly when we're looking at the application of academic knowledge to COVID-19, we haven't seen, your comment before that I said it's everywhere, everyone and everything. We haven't seen anything as big as this before, with so many primary and secondary impacts. And I think all of the different disciplines and subject areas are thinking about what they can sensibly bring forward and extrapolate across from previous knowledge, where that more confidence comes from and where things are less obvious. But certainly I don't see that we're particularly different to other subjects, other disciplines, because the world is changing, not just with COVID-19, but when we're talking to colleagues around kind of economic modelling, they have to keep up with that pace of change of the world just as we do. So I don't think we're particularly disadvantaged in that. No.
I think for psychologists it's a fascinating time in terms of balancing the amazing contribution that psychologists can make and are making with some intellectual humility over how many of the answers we have. And I found it particularly interesting yesterday when the names of SAGE were made available online, and I saw that Professor Dame Teresa Marto is on SAGE. We interviewed her a couple of years back for the Psychologist, and that was the headline from that interview, was a bit of greater humility will actually paradoxically lead to greater impact for psychology. And I've done other interviews in the last month or so where psychologists have talked about having that bit of intellectual humility, not kind of getting carried away trying to run before we can walk with a research response that says, oh, we've definitely got all the answers to this, but at the same time growing in confidence about the way we approach questions like this and what makes that distinct, I think.
Sorry.
There's something for me in terms of the sense of what policymakers are asking for, and I think there's a sense for me in this response of us kind of growing together a little bit, and the sense that policymakers quite often will ask questions that have black and white answers, that will be they're looking for something that's this kind of solid, this is definitely the right answer, and of course they are, because that's what you want. You don't want to sort of put all your eggs in one basket without knowing that that's going to be the right way to do it. Whereas actually what we're experiencing now is a place of saying, well, it's very, very complex, and particularly around some of these behavioural responses, we can't say that everybody will definitely do the thing that we think they will do, and that people change on a daily basis. People change on a, depending on their context, depending on, their personal circumstance. And I think what we're seeing is a bit more of an acceptance that it is complex, that policymakers will have to sit with a bit of uncertainty and be able to sort of deal with that in the best way possible. And I think that's something that we need to continue to sort of work on, both in terms of our ability as psychologists to kind of explain that, and to, you know, and I think if you think about our discipline in terms of where we are at our most theoretical and our, you know, our least evidence-based versus our, you know, our most evidence-based at the other end, I think it's about sort of thinking about what's most appropriate and potentially taking policymakers on a journey with us that says, you know, we can help you with this definite bit, we can help you think about this bit with some theoretical models, there's a bit more uncertainty at this end which we can help you think about in other ways. They might be a bit less comfortable for policymakers, but I think, you know, it's all part of that approach that we have. And I think there's certainly, you know, ways where we can engage with policymakers to be saying, you know, you're not quite asking, but you are asking the right question, but, you know, there's different answers to it, and if you asked it in this way, we can help you with that in a different way.
So if I could add to that, I mean, we're in an incredibly uncertain situation. The disease is uncertain, the response of people to it's uncertain. If you remember when Wuhan was locked down, everybody said, well, that's China, that's a different kind of society. It would never happen here. The British people would never put up with it. Lo and behold, a few weeks later, here we are, you know, overwhelmingly adhering to the guidelines. So I think it is unprecedented in terms of uncertainty and unpredictableness. But on the other hand, government needs to take decisions about what to do. And so, you know, scientists have to be able to help in that arena of making decisions. I mean, we give scientific advice for them to make decisions, because obviously there's economic and political and other factors come into play. But we have to make sure that the advice is geared to be helpful in terms of making decisions. And I think personally, one of the things that I found really interesting about these last few weeks is being forced to apply what one knows to a completely different situation alongside other people from other disciplines who are in exactly the same situation. So the Stage Behavioural Science Committee has an amazing group of social and behavioural scientists, sociology, anthropology, social psychology, health psychology, emergency psychology, all in the same situation, together collectively, drawing on what expertise we have, what knowledge we have, to bring it together to give some rounded practical advice. And one of the things that, you know, I think I've been working in policy over decades now, but becoming acutely clear, picking up on Kathryn, what you said about policymakers asking the right questions. It's so true that the better the question is formulated, the more likely we as scientists and psychologists are going to be able to give a helpful answer. But on the other hand, the other side of that coin is, how do we give a good answer? And that's where I've seen that some of our papers are rather discursive. We need to give headlines, you know, and very action problem orientated. I'm doing some consultancy work with WHO around COVID to help them structure government reports based on polling data, global polling data, to translate that data into actionable recommendations for countries, you know, which hasn't to this date been done. And so one of the things actually together with Professor Robert West is we're going to, or have begun to produce a sort of template as for policymakers, how to ask a good question, and for scientists, how to give a good answer. Because I think that is really helpful in terms of that interaction and joint working.
Rowena, in terms of your trawling the evidence for looking further down the line, is that the sort of thing that you're looking for, the practical utility of the research synthesis?
Yeah, very much so. And I think, just going back a bit before I flesh out that answer a little bit more, one of the things that I found, seeing as I'm working very kind of multidisciplinary, is the BPS were one of the first professional regulatory bodies to do a COVID-19 response, and that was very actionable. And so it might be that sometimes in the discipline we're in, we feel sometimes that we're not being as bold, or we think that there might be a little bit of a gap here. But actually, I think as a discipline, we are aware of that. And And so seeing that response from the BPS, when we look at others, and I'm not necessarily comparing or making a value judgment, but we think about those things quite a lot as psychologists and consider that weight of evidence and where that is. And I'm not saying others don't, but as a collective discipline, from the outside looking in, we were very aware of those, and we were able to write those down really quickly and formulate thoughts about them, and come together as a collective and kind of, to want a best word, kind of agree those. The other disciplines are just kind of formulating their responses on their websites and formulating that COVID-19 response, I suppose. So I think there's something about reflexivity or reflection that we're doing as a discipline, that we think about those things quite a bit.
That's experience that we're a reflective discipline, a very self-critical, self-policing, self-analytical discipline. I think that has pros and cons, and maybe this situation is one where that tendency of psychologists really comes into its own. I'm just going to pause the discussion for a little bit to bring in Saskia with a couple of questions now, because I was going to do that after 20 minutes, but I'm a terrible it's already 40 minutes in. So hopefully now we will hear the voice of Saskia with a question.
Hello, everyone. Oh my. So we have a combined question from Gareth and Mark Corrad from the chats. So it's about people's behavior changing during lockdown. Initially, there was a real sense of togetherness, but to what extent can social connection and community relationships last as we move forward, especially once people get to the understanding that there will be no return to a norm that we knew? How do we prepare the public for this?
I think well, all I'll say on that before I field it to one of the discussants is that this links back to some of the points that we were making about what was expected of the public. And I think from my perspective, it's been interesting that perhaps what's happened has shown a greater degree of compliance than was expected. There's suggestions that the government weren't really expecting people to adhere to the restrictions with quite the zeal that they have. But my understanding is that the psychologists did suggest a more positive view of human nature, that was likely to happen. So, what happens coming out of that, it would be interesting to hear views from the discussants on whether that's going to be driven by potentially quite a positive view of compliance and human nature.
Well, I agree. I mean, we've seen incredible acts of collective solidarity, of generosity, of altruism, helping people. And, we know from the evidence that in emergencies and crises, that's generally what happens. And in terms of keeping that going, Saskia, you said, what do we need to do to prepare the public? I'm not quite sure who we are in that situation, but I think that one of the things that I've thought about a lot is really the extent to which the public, or however we want to say it, the people around us, the citizens of this country, how little they've really been brought into discussions and engaged in any real meaningful way. And I would say it's not really about we preparing the public. I think it's about ensuring that the public have more of a voice and be part of generating solutions. And part of thinking strategically about how to go forward. And I think that would strengthen everything. Jon, you touched on this contact tracing app that's being piloted this week in the Isle of Wight and is due to be rolled out next week or the week after in the UK, which has been used very successfully in some countries, good take up. But it's absolutely key to trying to suppress this pandemic. But there hasn't been engagement of the public, or indeed of any communities, in discussing this app, which is using Bluetooth technology to swap data, to keep data centrally. There's been no discussion of the governance, of the security, of the privacy, all sorts of ethical issues. Indeed, the provenance. It's called an NHS app, but it's owned by a private company. And my concern is, I think this is a really good illustration, if you don't engage the public in any meaningful way as one goes along in uncertain situations where new kind of strategies need to be used, then my fear is you'll get distrust, you'll get resistance, and then you won't get take up, and then you're on the back foot, and all the investment that's been put into that technology is wasted because the human element of that, i.e. how are people going to perceive and engage with this, hasn't been taken on board at all.
I mean, Matt Hancock said this morning that the data is stored on your phone until you need to order a test, at which point they need to know who you are. And he then went on really to just appeal to a general sense of public duty, which it was kind of like, oh, you don't have to, it's not a compulsory app, but you'll be doing your bit for the country and protecting loved ones if you have the app. So I suppose, Rowena, just coming to you, to what extent is that public voice part of the discussions in the Foresight Group, because you've got that view a little bit further down the line?
I think the discussions are very much that it's needed, it's necessary, it's essential. I think it's also very much taking the view that actually with this, the public were our responders. So you pay tribute to all of the key workers at the start, John, but actually without the public, we wouldn't have been able to respond to COVID-19. So they already are active participants as well as being community participants. How we take that forward and how that might, how that narrative at national level starts, and how that conversation, and should be a conversation, I agree with Susan, at a subnational level. I think there's some really good practice that we're trying to draw upon, particularly around community participation and two-way conversations. But it should be a conversation around going forward, definitely. It's just about again, we're down to practicalities, aren't we? How to make that happen.
I think it's too little, too late of it. Often, you know, the government being on its back foot instead of anticipating this. They knew this was coming weeks ago and nothing's happened. So I really think this is an area where psychology, behavioural science, social science can really influence the government to do things well in advance and not wait till we're actually in the middle of something.
Yeah.
Have we got another question, Saskia?
We do. We have one from Juliet Young. On the everything, everywhere, and everyone point, is there an acknowledgement that some groups of people are being disproportionately impacted? And if so, are there any reflections on how community psychology approaches could be used to respond to psychological distress as a result of COVID-19?
I'm going to come to Kathryn on that one, because I know that links in with at least, well, one of the BPS work streams, plus the diversity and inclusion work that goes across all 8 work streams. Am I?
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I think I'm just sort of picking up this point, and then one from the previous question as well, is that there's some policies give you agency, yeah, and some take your agency away from you. And I think that's something that, you know, is a really important thread that we have to think about going through this response, because that lockdown policy took away a lot of agency from people, and that's something that, you know, it's really, if you're thinking about what good social policy looks like, it's about empowering people. It's about, you know, giving people as much sort of ability to influence their own lives as you can. I think what we can learn from sort of community psychology perspectives is about, you know, as Susan alluded to before, asking people what they want. And I think part of that is about thinking in this response particularly. I mean, community psychology approaches, you know, at a local level are really important, but what this needs to tie in with is that sense of what the kind of pragmatic and practical barriers that we're facing at the moment. So if you think about what, you know, the almost, in reflection, the simplicity of the stay-at-home message versus, for example, the complexity of bring the kids back to school. It might not be all the children at the same time, it might not be on the same day, school's going to feel a bit different, we're going to have to, you know, and that level of complexity, giving people enough time to to respond to that, to feel agency over how they then play that out themselves, is really, really important, alongside with, thinking about how you have the kind of clarity of message around that in these sorts of areas. So I think that, that listening is really, really important, and coupling that with, giving people agency over, controlling as much of their lives as they can.
Saskia, should we have one more question at this point?
Right. Let's see. You went to me way too quickly.
On the hop there.
That's absolutely fine. Here, there is a question here from Sue Ledwith about actually building on the community point that Kathryn just brought up, which is about the range of neighborhood networks that have developed organically. How can they be involved in supporting macro level policy initiatives? So there is to rephrase, there is a vacuum between what's happening at the grassroots level, where people are taking things within their own hands, while then waiting for government to approach with top-down universal approach. How do we meld both sides?
That's interesting to just flag up another piece on the Psychologist website. Carl Walker wrote for us about the mutual aid response, and the phrase he used is, what's been remarkable about what's happened has been that it's unremarkable. In some ways, we should have expected this kind of local community response, yet it seems that in terms of the NHS volunteers system, it wasn't really expected. We've got hundreds of thousands of NHS volunteers that aren't necessarily being used to the extent that perhaps was planned, because that response is happening at the local community level. So,
or because there's not an infrastructure for them to work within.
Comes back to opportunity again, yeah.
Yeah.
Rowena, have you got thoughts on that in terms of building up, I suppose, joining the dots between local community responses and government, cross-governmental response?
I think as we move forward, I think the national governmental response will be there in the background as a framework, but the hard work, I think, will be done at that subnational level, at that community level. And I think how that is made sustainable, and how that goes from being something that we've done at community level to help for a period of time, and moving forward in supporting those emerging things that we haven't seen yet, that will need things further down the line, that I think psychology has a lot to offer in how we can support that and how we can approach that. With community psychology particularly, but also other areas of psychology where we know how those enriching environments can be created, and then converting that into policy, I think, is something that we have to work hard to do.
I suggest we're back to big society,
Yeah, because it's a complicated message again that's hard to stick.
You pointed out just how adverse the economic conditions are going to be for, nationally, globally, for quite some time. That's something where psychologists have been responding in recent years in terms of Psychologists Against Austerity, those kinds of initiatives, Psychologists for Social Change. Yeah. So in some ways, we've got a running start on the conditions that we're likely to see economically and the effects that that's going to have. But I think you're looking to do more than just say those economic conditions are going to have bad psychological effects. It's a more nuanced response again.
There's something about capturing what we want to keep, and I think that's a really important thing that we can be doing in the policy team, and also thinking about what there's been so many amazing policy responses. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were seeing announcements on a daily basis. We had as many announcements in a week that you'd normally see in a couple of years, and I think, for example, the response on homelessness, originally the target was to end homelessness by 2025, and that changed to by the weekend, and it's that sort of level of trying to capture that sense of how we can harness the power of things like those mutual aid groups, and also use that that response to kind of hold various, you know, bits of the government to account in the future when it starts to be, you know, back to some sort of new normal. The kind of some of the sort of responses will be easier challenged, or easier to think around, or easier to sort of, you know, think of different scale of ambition because of what we've seen, you know. And I think that's going to be really important to sort of hold on to that as we go forward.
But I think oh, sorry.
I was just going to have a question for all of the discussants, really, is, can you think of areas that, when we talked about unintended consequences, I think what I'm interested in at this point in terms of the new normal is an area that we perhaps haven't thought of at all, or hasn't really been discussed, hasn't really been on the policy agenda, that you think is going to be impacted in the new normal, that we should be getting ahead of the curve on? I've got one.
Well, I can say one negative and one positive.
Okay.
Just in response to what Kathryn was saying. What's happened, I mean, the government measures that have had to be put in place have made those who are already most disadvantaged in a very unequal society even more disadvantaged. And we know what the psychological consequences of inequalities are. And I think coming out of this, the key thing is we don't have a repeat of the 2008 financial crash, where those who are most disadvantaged paid even more. You know, there has to be quite a profound thinking about the nature of society and the way in which resources are distributed across society, so that we end up hopefully reducing, not increasing, inequality. On a positive side, one of the things that we've found out through this is the power of new technology, the possibilities of working at home with the right technical and social support networks built in a way that I think many employers never thought was possible. And for many people, this is saving hours of miserable commute every day, which is bad for mental health, bad for physical health, bad for their income and their pockets because it's very expensive, and bad for the environment. And the, you know, actual emergency is an even bigger emergency than this one. So I think it's really important that we hang on to this, tying it in with a sense of community. Obviously what work gives is collegiality, social connectedness, friendships, relationships. All these things are incredibly important, but these could be provided much more within the community. So we could have local working hubs and much more community infrastructure, which I think would make for a much healthier society and much healthier people.
In terms of academia, I've been at international conferences when you've sent a video presentation, you know, at least in part for environmental reasons. Yeah. I know there's a group, Academics Against Flying. We've reported on their conference in the Psychologist. So, you know, maybe it would be good if that part was kept of more remote. Yeah. Rowena, your surprising aspect that we should be looking out for?
Surprising aspect, I think, is probably more processes. I think it's touched on something that Kathryn has mentioned before. It's the speed of what we can do and the scale of what we can do quickly when we all want to, and how we can either use that or pause that in the future. So obviously, you know, the biggest comparator is the environmental crisis, as you just alluded to, and how there's been lots of discussion. So it's not necessarily, there's been lots of discussion in the public narrative about how we have responded to this, and we could have responded to environmental crisis and we didn't. So it's not necessarily that, because that's not the new bit, but I don't think COVID-19 has finished challenging us yet. I think there's a lot in that secondary impacts and further down the road of the things that we haven't seen, that actually that process of being able to do stuff quickly together and make stuff happen, I think is something that we probably might need to keep in our back pockets more regularly than we would care to admit at the moment.
That's interesting. War metaphors have been used from time to time, and I know that during the World War, First World War, Second World War, when the government wanted answers from scientists and said, we need it by next Tuesday, they got it by next Tuesday. So it's
wow, I'm being asked for 6 hours ago, so that sounds like a holiday.
Next Tuesday. I'll just mention mine while I've still got it in my head, and then I'll come to you, Kathryn. So another piece that we've had on the Psychologist website in the last few days was from Kathryn Scott, the health psychologist, on vaccinations. And that's an area where you wouldn't perhaps think that there was much in the way of a psychological input to the physical health side of having a vaccination. But she makes the point that there's a difference between having a vaccine and having an effective vaccine. And with a lot of studies show that even with the seasonal flu vaccine, success rates in older population might be around 17, 20%. And how successful a vaccination is dependent, at least in part, on psychological factors, even down to things like mood on the day of vaccination. You know, these are clinically significant effects that have been found in quality previous research. And you know, when we do hopefully get to the stage of having a vaccine, psychology will have a role to play in that. It's well worth a read, that piece. Kathryn.
Can I have a good one and a bad one as well?
As long as they're quick, because I want to.
Okay, I'll be quick. Okay, so I think in terms of what I think negative implications is, I don't think we yet understand quite the extent of the mental health burden, whatever way you want to describe it, in terms of what is approaching. I think we can look at there's potential ways to model what that might look like, but we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. And I think particularly children and young people's mental health, which was the focus of our Senate campaign at the BPS last year, I think that's something that's going to be really, really important. And I think also thinking about the role that teachers play in their students' mental health and the pressures that the additional pressures that they may be facing needs to be considered as part of that, you know, all of that back to school agenda. I think that's really, really important.
I second that with 2 teenage boys in the house.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's going to be something around, you know, not being amongst, you know, peers for a certain amount of time developmentally. You know, there's implications there. I think the more positive element that I see is a sort of an understanding about this kind of people being the units of policy making, and that, you know, that policy impacts on humans in a human way, and that, you know, as we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation around fear and anxiety and identity and agency and all of these things that we study as psychologists, that actually are things that people are starting to have front of mind in a way that they didn't before. And I think one of the hopeful things that will come out of that is that, you know, where we have had questions that haven't been answered, but we know how we would have answered them were to be able to go back in time and fund that piece of research. You know, I'm hoping that will be something that we can, you know, strengthen our argument for that sort of investment in answering these kinds of questions.
Okay. Saskia, 15 minutes until the end of the webinar that we'd like to use for questions, please.
Amazing. So climate change has been really a question that a lot of people have brought up in the chat. So there's a comment from 451 about the climate emergency, where we need to consider the word normal. The new normal seems to imply an old normal. Our pre-COVID world could hardly be described as normal. Some people don't want the personal and social changes they have made to continue, but others do. So how do we help people reflect, harness, and embed some of these positive changes to help themselves and the world rather than just going back to normal?
I'm going to go to Rowena for that one because it is looking further down the line.
That's a complicated one, isn't it?
When we spoke last week, you seemed to suggest that the old normal, you know, things are going to be so different because of the economic impacts that a new normal is forced upon us in that sense, and it's quite drastic.
It is, but the nature of the question, if I heard it right, was particularly around those nuances of individual experience and how some people might want to move towards something different to others. And that's something that in the Foresight Group we're definitely quite conscious that it speaks to. A lot of our conversations are around not viewing communities as homogenous masses. It just doesn't work. It's not nice and it's not the right thing to do. But when you start looking at how this impacts at a family level, or how this is impacting at an individual level, different people will be experiencing, you just alluded to, you have two teenage children at home. I don't, I live on my own. So we're experiencing things very differently. So how we want new normal to be is probably going to have some commonality, but it's going to be quite different as to how the pace of change that we would like to see, the type of change that we would like to see, the type of leadership and where that leadership comes from is probably going to be quite different. So that's why I pause for quite a while there to think through. I think that's probably going to be one of our greatest challenges, which is why I don't have a sensible answer yet, to be honest.
Well, I mean, I think that is a sensible answer in terms of bringing it back to leadership, because again, when I spoke to you last week and I said, has this truly been led by the science? You said, informed by the science. It's led by politicians. That's why they're politicians. That's why we don't vote for scientists. We vote for politicians. And I know, Susan, you've talked about that stage of translation of evidence from, you can only advise, really.
Yeah.
At the end, the politicians are going
the whole narrative about following the science is, well, as Sir David King said yesterday, are we being set up as fall guys for when things goes wrong? So actually arguably a political strategy that's being used. No, science is only one of many different things that goes into the picture. But in relation to the question that was being asked, and leadership, I really go back to what I was saying about mobilising and engaging communities. And when I say communities, I mean professional, scientific, civic society communities, neighbourhood communities, all the communities all over society. Get them engaged in thinking about what's the new world going to look like? What could it look like? And how do we prevent things going back to where they were, where basically money and profits talked above everything else? And I think what this is showing, that who are the people that are saving us at the moment? It's the most low paid people who are living, in not the best conditions in our society, who are the real heroes and heroines of the day. And I think if it does nothing else, what I hope it really shapes people into thinking about the question of values. We don't hear that word very often, values, but we need to, I think, really think about what are the key main values in our society and really try and get them into the heart. So we have a values-led society rather than a profit-led society. But that does mean ensuring routes of communication and routes of influence. And I think the population can't afford to sit back and hope that there'll be leadership in this direction without a lot of having loud voices heard and a bit of pushing and shoving. So I hope that there's considerable mobilisation. Kathryn used the word agency, so important that everybody tries to really build a sense of agency in this new situation and collectively tries to shape a new society.
Okay, can I just say to anyone who's asking questions, whether it's on the chat function or on Twitter, we are planning to collate these questions, unanswered questions, and find some way of opening those up for further discussion, potentially sharing them when we have the online version of this, the recording of this to share on the website. So if we don't get around to your question, apologies, but we will try to at some point in some way. We've got time for probably one, maybe two, a push more questions, Saskia.
We have a question from Annie McGowan about supporting children going back to school, particularly those with anxiety, and specifically the GCSE aspect of how do we avoid certain population groups being more penalized than others.
One of the things that I've been reflecting on recently is around the role of mental health support teams. So a policy that was introduced by this government a couple of years ago around providing additional support for children and young people, and that was around kind of whole school approaches. So I think that's something that we really need to think about is not, you know, not just the kind of one-on-one individual therapy, which is important and there will be a need for, but more about how do we respond to what will be a really large level of general need, and I think we'll be looking at kind of how would you put together a sort of stepped response, one that kind of deals with general increased levels of anxiety, one that encourages peer support, one that does have, you know, a way of signposting and supporting children who do need that extra bit of support. And again, you know, that as we were just talking about, you know, people will have experienced this very differently, you know, and I think that will be something where, you know, while teachers are coming back to a school scenario that feels different and that feels, you know, if we do social distancing in classrooms, you know, this place of safety for children, for schools may feel differently. We need to think about the implications of that. And I think, you know, particularly for those children who are looking at transition years. So the BPS is working on some guidance around returning to school, so that should be out as soon as we can get it done. But yeah, it will be about really calling on the government to give as much notice as possible, as much clarity as possible, as much support as possible, and thinking about, you know, what children are going to need at different levels.
Saskia,
I'd add two things to that. One is the huge differences in needs of children. You know, children in such different places, and so I think that's going to be very challenging, but all children must be thought about. And the other is that children are obviously part of systems. School is a system of teachers and of parents, and actually in dealing with children's anxieties, we actually also need to deal with teachers and parents' anxieties.
Yeah.
I often find myself coming back to that Bronfenbrenner model of the, you know, the circles, different ecological levels of impact.
Yeah.
Saskia, next question, please.
Yep, we have a question from Jennifer Cuff about whether there is scope for building on the skills required to be performed regarding behaviour change. So basically an argument to be made for upskilling the general population to actually enable those behaviours.
Well, I think it's a fantastic opportunity we have, because individual behaviour is at the heart of this pandemic. It's how we get ill and it's how we stop getting ill. You know, we are the people who have the skills to train everybody in how to manage one's own behaviour, how to learn self-regulatory skills of the behaviours that I mentioned, and all the other behaviours that are going to be required for adjusting to the highest quality life we can, and whatever the very varied circumstances that people are going to be in the months to come. So I hope the BPS takes the opportunity and has some very high-level discussions with the government about how we can really use our skills to train the population through many different channels in terms of changing behaviour. We need to have population level changes in all these personal protective behaviours, in the social distancing, and in many other behaviours that surround that. So I think it's a great opportunity we have, and I think it's really important we don't squander it.
I'm going to come in on that, and Kathryn, I'll probably tee you up, but this leads to a kind of wrapping up question that is, I think, for all of you. Picking up on what you've just said there, Susan, one of my favourite quotes at the moment is from a 1958 paper by Abraham Maslow, in which he issued a call to arms. He said, "I believe that the world will either be saved by the psychologists or it won't be saved at all. I think psychologists are the most important people living today. I think the fate of the human species and the future of the human species rest more upon their shoulders than upon any group of people now living." Now that was back in 1958, and I think from our discussion, from all three of you, I've got a sense of how that kind of ambition might be tempered somewhat, and you might be looking to work alongside other disciplines with a bit of intellectual humility about how many of the answers we have. But I'm going to come to Kathryn in terms of your response to that kind of ambition.
That is ambition, certainly is. No, I mean, I think one of the calls that it's about confidence, and it's about not, and I think that there's a sense of sometimes I feel that we kind of apologise for the complexity of our discipline, and we should be celebrating the complexity of our discipline, or our attempts to understand this complex world that we live in. And I think that quote might be quite grand, but there's certainly something in it about in complex times you need people who understand complexity.
I've just seen one of the comments coming up in the chat: reach for the moon, land on the stars, from which might be a pretty good note to end on. But I think if Rowena and Susan, if you just want to come in on that ambition and psychology's place within the overall response to close off.
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Don't mind.
Let's go Susan first, because Rowena, you've got that foresight to take us further into the future. So Susan.
Well, in terms of contribution, I think that our ability to work with other scientists, and actually beyond social and behavioural scientists, computer scientists, engineering scientists, there's so many different scientific approaches that are pertinent to solving this problem. So really thinking about human beings as interacting with their material and social environment around them. So I think looking forwards in terms of what I'd like to see is a much more interdisciplinary collaboration, but at the same time, recognizing that psychology has a unique role to play in understanding and changing behavior. And so I'd like to see us having a much bigger, more national, more policy and more politically engaged role, so that we can share the expertise and skills we have with the whole population in a way that we haven't hitherto been able to.
Rowena?
I think I'll echo both my fellow panelists there, discussants, but also certainly from my perspective in the role that I'm currently in. I work alongside a lot of different other academics and other disciplines. The thing that I keep coming back to is that we have, Susan said the word unique role, and I see it similar to that, but slightly different, in that if we're bringing all of those other disciplines together and all of that knowledge to bear, the main focus of that is people. People are changing, people are deciding, people are living with, people are deciding to, and we are the study of people. So can we do it on our own in psychology? I genuinely don't think we can, but I do think that we have a really major role in coordinating all of that and packaging that to the very essence of what we study and learn about and create knowledge about, and that is people. People are the things that we are interested in at this point in time. Not the only things in the world, but it's certainly the main impacts are happening to people.
Thank you very much, Rowena. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, Kathryn. I think that's 5:15 on the dot. I just want to, before people leave, I just want to say thank you very much for participating in this webinar. We're hoping to do more of them. This isn't the first BPS one. There was a very successful one led by the President, David Murphy, which is available to view online. Hopefully this will be too. Keep an eye on @PsychMag on Twitter for some of the discussion. Help us to share the dozens of perspectives that we've got on the Psychologist website and all the support and guidance which is being collated through the main BPS website, bps.org.uk. Thank you to Bijal and Saskia for setting it up, and I hope to see you in the new normal. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for taking part.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers, bye.